The crown landed at her feet like a dead thing. It hit the stone floor of the great hall with a sound that silenced 300 wolves, gold and garnet, heavy enough to bruise, rolling in a slow, wobbling arc before it came to rest against the toe of her boot. Sable stared down at it, her mind completely, devastatingly blank. Around her, the court of Iron Veil had gone perfectly, unnaturally still. Nobles in silks and furs stood frozen mid-breath. Servants clutched their trays like anchors. A wine glass slipped from someone's fingers and shattered on the marble, and not a single person flinched because every eye in the room was locked on her. A child somewhere in the back of the hall whimpered and was hushed so quickly it was as if the sound had been swallowed. And at the top of the dais, King Calum Vasren, Alpha of Iron Vale, sovereign of 7 territories, the man whose name alone had ended sieges and toppled rival bloodlines, stood with his hand still extended from the throw. His dark eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made the air feel too thick to breathe. "Pick it up," he said. His voice carried without effort, low and absolute, a voice that moved armies and broke the resolve of lesser men. It moved through Sable like a second heartbeat, like something that had always been there, and was only now making itself known. She did not pick it up. She couldn't. Her hands were shaking too badly, and her mind was still trying to reconcile the impossible chain of events that had led to this moment. 8 months ago, she had been nothing, less than nothing, a wolfless girl with no rank, no name worth speaking, no future beyond the walls of a pack that had thrown her out like spoiled grain. And now the most powerful alpha in the known world had just thrown his crown at her feet in front of his entire court and told her to pick it up. "I think there has been a mistake," Sable whispered. "There is no mistake," Calum said. Something raw flickered behind his expression, almost like desperation disguised as command, like a man drowning who had finally found something solid to hold on to. "You are the only one I will ever choose. The only one I can choose." The murmuring started then, low and scandalized, rippling through the crowd like wind through dry grass. She could feel their eyes, hundreds of them, crawling over her plain healer's dress among all this silk and velvet, over the pale scars on her wrists, where silver shackles had bitten into skin and left their permanent record. She looked like what she was, a cast-off, an exile, a healer from the lower levels of this very palace, standing where queens were meant to stand. And the king had chosen her. Sable. His voice again, softer now, almost gentle, and that was somehow worse because gentleness from a man like him felt like watching a mountain kneel. "Pick up the crown." 8 months earlier, Sable had not known his name. 8 months earlier, she had been on her knees in the mud outside Thornfield's eastern gate, watching the only home she had ever known shrink into the distance while her stepsister smiled from the wall, and her father's silence roared louder than any exile decree. She had been no one, and then she had been found. This is the story of how she went from the mud to the crown, from exile to queen, from a girl with no wolf to the most important woman in the kingdom, and every impossible, terrible, beautiful thing that happened in between. But to understand why the king threw his crown at the feet of a girl the world had thrown away, you have to start with the betrayal. The Thornfield pack had never been kind to Sable, but it had been home, and for 22 years, that had been enough. She was the only daughter of Aldrich Voss, the pack's senior tracker and a man respected for his skill, if not his warmth. Her mother had died giving birth to her, a fact that Sable's stepmother Marin never let her forget. Not with words, Marin was far too clever for anything that could be quoted back. It was in the silences. The plate set slightly apart at dinner. The way Marin's hand always found Lisette's shoulder first when visitors arrived, positioning her own daughter in front like a display, like the only child worth presenting. Lisette was Marin's daughter from her first mating. Golden-haired, green-eyed, blessed with an early shift at 13 that had made the entire pack celebrate. Lisette was everything Sable was not. Bright where Sable was quiet, adored where Sable was tolerated, centered where Sable orbited the edges of every room she entered. And Sable's wolf had never come. At first, the pack had been patient. Late shifts happened. But the years kept passing, and the silence inside her where a wolf should have lived grew louder with every season. By 17, the whispers had started, hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. By 19, they had hardened into certainty. Wolfless, defective, a human soul trapped in a shifter bloodline, taking up space in a world that had no use for what she was. An embarrassment to her father's name. Sable had survived by being useful. She learned herbcraft from the pack's aging healer, memorized every root and remedy and dosage, became the one people called for when a pup had croup at midnight, or a hunter came home with a wound that wouldn't close. She made herself necessary because necessary was the closest thing to wanted that she could reach. She told herself it was enough. She almost believed it. The trouble began when Darius Cray arrived. He was the second son of the Ashenmore Pack's Alpha, sent to Thornfield to negotiate a trade alliance. Tall, sharp-jawed, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no and fully expected that record to continue. Lisette wanted him immediately. The wanting was loud and all-consuming, filling every room, leaving no space for anything else. And what Lisette wanted, Marin made sure she got. The courtship was public and performative, Lisette laughing too loudly at his jokes, Darius's hand finding the small of her back at every gathering. Sable watched from the edges, uninvolved. She had no stake in this. Until the night Darius found her alone in the herb shed. She was grinding valerian root by lantern light, her hands stained green, when his shadow filled the doorway. "You are the interesting one," he said, leaning against the door frame. "Everyone talks about the golden girl, but you are the one I keep noticing." "You are courting my stepsister," Sable said flatly, not looking up. "Your options are not in this shed. Good night, my lord." He came back the next night. And the next. Each time, Sable shut him down firmly, without a shred of ambiguity. Each time, something behind his eyes hardened. She never told Lisette. That was the mistake that cost her everything. On the fourth night, Darius went to Marin. He told her that Sable had been pursuing him relentlessly, cornering him after dark, making desperate advances, trying to sabotage Lisette's courtship out of jealousy. She was summoned to the pack hall the following morning, still smelling of chamomile and sleep, her feet bare on the cold stone floor. The entire senior council sat in a half circle, their faces grim. Pack members lined the walls, a few looking satisfied in a way that made Sable's stomach clench. Her father stood to one side, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a point above her head. He would not look at her. Marin stood at the center, arm around a weeping Lisette, whose tears fell with practiced precision. "She has been pursuing my daughter's intended mate, cornering him alone at night, making shameless advances." The lie was so enormous, so perfectly inverted from the truth, that Sable's mind went blank. Darius spoke first. "I tried to let her down gently," he said, shaking his head with rehearsed regret, but she wouldn't stop. Then she looked at her father, Aldrich Voss, senior tracker, the only person in this room whose word could have saved her, whose testimony could have shattered this grotesque theater, looked at his daughter, and said nothing. The silence lasted 3 seconds. In them, 22 years of desperate, quiet hope collapsed like a structure whose foundation had been rotting all along. He knew Marin, he knew Lisette, he knew his own daughter, and he chose silence. The council voted within the hour. Exile. Effective immediately. No provisions, no escort, no appeal. They put silver cuffs on her wrists because protocol demanded it, even though she had no wolf to suppress. The metal burned her skin anyway, and Sable clenched her jaw until it ached rather than give them the satisfaction of hearing her cry. Lisette watched from Marin's side, dry-eyed now, satisfied. Her father watched from the steps. His mouth opened once. Then Marin's hand found his arm, a leash disguised as affection, and he closed it again. Sable walked through the eastern gate alone, into a world she had never navigated without a pack, without protection, without a single person who cared whether she lived or died. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the road, and the wind carried the scent of pine and distance, and nothing that resembled home. The gate closed behind her with a sound like a jaw snapping shut. She did not look back. The first 3 days nearly killed her. Not dramatically, not with any single catastrophic event, but in the slow, grinding way that exposure and hunger take a body apart piece by piece. The silver cuffs stayed on her wrists because she had no key and no tools fine enough to pick the locks. They chafed and burned without rest, the skin beneath going raw and weeping before crusting over in ridges that cracked open again every time she moved her hands. She walked south because south was the only direction that didn't lead into another pack's territory. The unclaimed lands were vast and merciless, thick forests that blocked the sun, ravines that appeared without warning, and the constant presence of things that hunted in the dark. Things that didn't care she was someone's daughter. Things that smelled weakness the way her people smelled fear. On the first night, she climbed a tree and wedged herself between 2 branches and listened to something large move through the undergrowth below for 3 hours. Her arms shook from holding herself in place. Her wrists screamed where the bark pressed against the cuffs. On the second night, she found a shallow cave and pressed her back against cold stone and shook until the shaking became stillness, and the stillness became something close to sleep. She didn't cry. Crying required energy she couldn't afford to spend, calories she didn't have, water her body couldn't waste. She cataloged what she had: the clothes on her back, already tearing at the seams, the knowledge in her head, every herb, every remedy, every healing technique she'd spent a decade memorizing, her hands, still steady when they needed to be. That was everything. On the third morning, she found yarrow growing wild near a creek bed, and almost laughed at the absurdity. The first useful thing the world had offered her, and it was a plant for stopping bleeding. She harvested it with shaking fingers and treated the inflamed wounds beneath her cuffs, hissing through her teeth at the sting. She drank from the creek, checked for signs of contamination, found it clean, and drank until her stomach ached. Then she allowed herself exactly 60 seconds of despair. She counted them. At 60, she stood up and kept walking. On the 4th day, she heard the wolves. Not Thornfield wolves. Different. Moving fast through the trees, a coordinated patrol, 6 or 7 strong. She pressed herself flat against a fallen oak and held her breath as shadows flowed through the undergrowth, massive and fluid and terrifying. They passed without slowing. A scout doubled back 20 minutes later, a lean gray wolf that shifted behind a screen of brush and emerged as a hard-eyed woman with close-cropped hair, a scar splitting her left eyebrow, and posture that said she had killed people before and would not hesitate to do so again. "You're on Ironvale land," the woman said. Not hostile, but not friendly. Her gaze dropped to the silver cuffs. "Exile?" "Yes." "Can you walk further?" Sable met her gaze and held it, even though every instinct told her to look away. "I can walk as far as I need to." Something shifted in the woman's expression, a loosening of the hardest edges. "I'm Hadrian's border watch. You'll come with me. The sovereign will decide what to do with you." The border camp was half a day's march south, a tight collection of canvas tents in precise military formation. They brought her to a tent at the center where a woman with silver-streaked auburn hair and steady, deep-set dark eyes sat behind a field desk covered in maps and medical reports. Orla, the scout said, exiled, silver-cuffed, no shift. Orla rose without a word, crossed to Sable and took her hands gently, turning them to examine the damage beneath the cuffs. These need to come off, Orla said quietly. She produced a thin iron pick and had both cuffs open in under 10 seconds. The metal fell away, and the relief was so sudden, so acute, that Sable's knees buckled. Orla caught her by the elbow, firm and unhurried, and guided her to a chair. When did you last eat? I'm not sure. Orla pressed a cup of warm broth into her hands. Tell me your name. Sable Voss. Tell me what happened, Sable Voss. And Sable told the truth to a stranger because she had no one else left to tell it to. Because the truth had to go somewhere, or it would eat her alive. Orla listened without interrupting. Not once. When Sable finished, the older woman was quiet for a long time. We need healers, Orla said finally. Badly. The Sovereign's army has been stretched thin, and our field medics are overworked. I can offer you work, shelter, a place in this camp, not as a member of the pack, but as a contracted healer under my supervision. You'll eat. You'll sleep under canvas instead of rock, and you'll be useful, which I suspect matters to you more than comfort. A place. Not a home, not yet, maybe not ever, but a place. A reason to wake up tomorrow. Yes, she said. I'll take it. That night, lying on a thin bedroll in a tent that smelled of canvas and wood smoke, Sable felt something small and stubborn take root inside her, pushing up through the wreckage like a green shoot through cracked stone. A door had opened somewhere, and on the other side of it was a life she hadn't imagined yet. And somewhere south of here, in a palace she had never seen, a king she had never met was making a decision that would change everything. She just didn't know it yet. Sable spent 2 months in Orla's border camp, and in those 2 months, she rebuilt herself from the ground up. The first days were humbling. The Iron Veil healers had formal training, structured methodologies, a system of classification that made Sable's self-taught knowledge feel like scattered pages from a dozen different books. She mislabeled a tincture on her second day and received a dressing down from a field medic named Theron, who had zero patience for mistakes, and even less for the apologies that followed. Sorry doesn't unpoison a patient, he told her flatly. Learn the system or go home. He caught himself on the last word, glanced at her face, and had the decency to look uncomfortable. But she could do the work. When it was just her and a wounded body, and the question of what to do next, her instincts were sound. She knew plants the way some people knew music, an intuition that told her which leaf to reach for before her conscious mind caught up, that let her smell a wound and know which herb would draw the infection before she'd even cleaned the site. By the 4th week, Theron had stopped correcting her. By the 6th, the corrections had reversed entirely, and she caught him using one of her poultice variations on a scout with a badly infected laceration. He didn't credit her. She didn't need him to. You've got instinct, Orla told her one evening. True instinct. I haven't seen that in a very long time. Then came the summons. A rider arrived at dawn, mud-splattered and breathing hard. Orla found Sable in the supply tent sorting dried calendula blossoms. Pack your things. We've been called to the capital. The Sovereign wants the best field healers from every outpost. She paused, and something that might have been pride crossed her weathered face. I recommended you. I've been here 2 months. I'm not even part of the pack. I have no credentials, no formal anything. You are the most gifted herbalist I've seen in 20 years. Pack membership has nothing to do with skill. The journey took 4 days. Every mile south brought a grander landscape, wild territories giving way to farmland golden with late-season grain, then villages, then roads wide enough for 3 carts abreast, and finally the capital itself, rising from a valley floor in tiers of pale stone and dark timber, the palace at its highest point. Breathe, Orla said beside her. It's just a building. It's a building where a king lives, Sable muttered. Kings are just men with heavier chairs. 12 healers were evaluated over 3 days. Identification of 200 herbs under time pressure. Treatment of simulated injuries. Diagnosis from verbal descriptions alone. Sable was the youngest by a decade and the only one without certification. She passed every test. The chief physician, an austere man named Fenwick, whose expression suggested he had been born disappointed, called her to his office. "Your scores are the highest of the group," he said, looking personally offended by his own data. "Provisional status, 6-month review. Don't make me regret this." The palace infirmary became her world. She treated injuries, prepared medicines, assisted Orla with complex cases, and slowly, with the cautious patience of someone rebuilding on ground that had already collapsed once, began to feel like she was standing on solid earth. Months passed. She learned the palace rhythms, memorized the schedules of the guard rotations, knew which corridors were empty at what hours, which supply closets held which remedies, which physicians could be trusted with a difficult case, and which would panic and make things worse. She earned the quiet respect of colleagues who had initially dismissed her as an unqualified interloper, and settled into a life that was small and stable, and hers. For the first time, she woke each morning knowing where she would sleep that night, and the simple certainty of it felt like wealth. She did not see the king. He existed as a name spoken in hallways, a shadow in the upper levels. She heard he was young, barely 30, that he had won the throne through a challenge so brutal that 3 champions yielded before blows were struck, recognizing a dominance so absolute that fighting was simply a longer path to the same outcome. That he was brilliant and strategic, possessed of a wolf so powerful that lesser alphas couldn't hold his gaze. She also heard that something was wrong with him. Quiet rumors, spoken in supply closets and back corridors, that he'd been declining for months, that his inner circle was shrinking because he pushed away anyone who got close enough to see the cracks, that Hadrian, his beta, had been seen arguing with the palace physicians in hushed tones outside the king's quarters. "Is he ill?" Sable asked Orla one evening while they cleaned instruments. Something tightened around Orla's eyes. "There are things in this palace above both our stations, Sable. Leave it alone." She left it alone. Until the day Hadrian himself appeared in the infirmary doorway. Broad-shouldered and meticulously composed, with controlled stillness that suggested enormous power held in perfect check. "I need your most discreet healer," he said. His voice was calm, but beneath the calm was an edge of urgency he was working hard to suppress. "Now." Orla didn't hesitate. She turned to Sable. Hadrian led her through corridors she had never walked, up staircases she had never climbed, past guards whose expressions were so carefully blank they might as well have been carved from stone. The air changed as they ascended, growing warmer, heavier, thick with something she couldn't name. A pressure that settled against her skin and made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. And then her wolf stirred. Sable stumbled mid-step, catching herself against the wall. The thing that had been silent and absent her entire life, the hollow space she had grieved and mourned and eventually accepted as simply empty, simply broken, moved. Something warm and alive shifted inside that emptiness, pressing outward from within like a creature waking from a very long sleep. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, eyes wide, breath coming in sharp pulls. "Are you all right?" Hadrian asked, pausing on the stairs. "Fine," she lied, her heart hammering. They stopped at a heavy door. Hadrian pushed it open without knocking. The room beyond was dim, curtains drawn against the late afternoon light. A fire burned low in the stone hearth. Maps and correspondence covered every surface. And in a chair beside the dying fire, slumped forward with his head in his hands, sat the Alpha King of Ironvale. He was enormous. Even seated, even diminished, the sheer physical scale of him dominated the room. Broad shoulders, dark hair falling forward, forearms scarred with the pale lines of old wounds. But it was the exhaustion that stopped her. It radiated off him, bone deep and corrosive and profoundly wrong. The bruised hollows beneath his eyes looked like wounds. His hands trembled with a fine, constant vibration. His breath came shallow and labored, as though even drawing air cost him something he couldn't afford. This was a man who was dying, slowly, invisibly, from something no one could see. Hadrian closed the door behind them. "This is Sable, the healer Orla recommended." The king didn't look up. And then Sable's wolf, silent for 22 years, did something it had never done before. It howled. Not out loud, but inside her, a sound so fierce and desperate and absolute that it buckled her knees. Every instinct she possessed swung toward the broken man in the chair like a compass finding true north. The hollow that had been empty since birth was suddenly, overwhelmingly full. She gripped the door frame to keep herself upright, knuckles white, vision swimming. Hadrian caught her arm. "What's wrong?" Sable looked at the king, at the ruin of him, at the most powerful wolf in the known world sitting shattered in a dark room while his kingdom carried on above him, unaware. Her wolf keened with a recognition so primal it predated language. "Everything," she whispered. Hadrian closed the door and stood with his back against it, blocking any thought of escape. "How long has he been like this?" Sable asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Her wolf was straining toward the king with an intensity that made it hard to think, hard to breathe, hard to do anything except close the distance between them. 7 months, Hadrian said. It started slowly. Fatigue, difficulty concentrating, loss of appetite. We assumed overwork. He'd just ended the Sunderland campaign and absorbed 3 territories in the span of a year. Even an alpha of his strength has limits. Hadrian paused, his jaw tightening. But it didn't stop. It got worse. His wolf began retreating, pulling inward, becoming unreachable. He hasn't been able to shift in over 3 months. Sable's stomach dropped. For any wolf, the inability to shift was catastrophic. It meant the bond between human and wolf was fracturing. It meant something fundamental was breaking down. What have the physicians tried? Everything. Every tonic, every remedy, every technique in the palace archives. Fennec has consulted specialists from 4 territories. Nothing works. Nothing even slows it down. Hadrian's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Sable to see the fear beneath it. He's dying, and no one can tell me why. Sable looked at the king. His breathing had changed since she entered the room. Still labored, but steadying, as though her presence had introduced a variable his body was responding to. She took a step closer. His breath deepened. Another step. The tremor in his hands lessened. "What are you doing?" Hadrian asked sharply. "I don't know," Sable said honestly. She knelt beside the king's chair, close enough to feel the unnatural heat radiating from his skin, close enough to see the veins at his temples standing out like dark rivers beneath too pale skin. Her wolf was almost frantic now, surging forward with a keening urgency that was entirely new, entirely undeniable. She reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. The effect was immediate. His breathing dropped into a slow, deep rhythm. The tension in his shoulders released like a rope being cut. The tremor stopped completely. Something shifted in the air around them, a settling, a quieting, as though the room itself had exhaled. Calem's eyes opened. They were dark gray, almost black in the dim light. And when they focused on her face, Sable felt the impact like a physical blow to her sternum. His gaze held hers, confused and raw and searching. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was rough, scraped thin by exhaustion, but beneath the roughness was a depth that resonated through her. "Sable," she managed. "I'm a healer." His eyes moved over her face, reading something she couldn't name. Then they dropped to her hand on his arm, and a crease formed between his brows. "Why does it feel like that?" he murmured, almost to himself. He didn't answer his own question. His eyes closed again, and within seconds his breathing had deepened into something that sounded, impossibly, like the beginning of sleep. Sable watched his face soften, the hard lines of pain and exhaustion smoothing out as his body surrendered to a rest it had been denied for months. She looked at Hadrian. The beta was staring at them with an expression she couldn't decode. Shock, maybe, or something closer to desperate, fragile hope. "Don't move," Hadrian said quietly. "Whatever you're doing, don't stop." "I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here." "Then keep sitting there." She kept sitting there. 20 minutes became 40. 40 became an hour. Her knees ached against the stone floor. Her hand went numb where it rested on his arm. She could feel the steady pulse beneath his skin, strong and rhythmic, so different from the thready, irregular beat she had sensed when she first touched him. Color was returning to his face in slow degrees, the ashen pallor warming, the bruised shadows beneath his eyes softening as though something inside him was finally being replenished. Whatever was consuming him couldn't reach him while she was here. She didn't understand it. She didn't need to. The king was sleeping, genuinely sleeping, his face peaceful in a way that looked almost unfamiliar, as though peace were a language his features had forgotten. When Hadrian finally gestured for her to stand, she removed her hand as slowly as she could. Caleb stirred but didn't wake, his head tilting slightly as though following her warmth. In the corridor, Hadrian spoke without looking at her. "The king has not slept more than 10 minutes at a time in 4 months," he said. "You just gave him an hour." He turned to face her, and his expression had shifted into something harder, more focused, the look of a man who had found a weapon he intended to use. "You will come back tomorrow evening. Same time. Same arrangement. This does not leave this corridor. Understood?" "And Sable?" he added as she turned to go. "If he dies, this kingdom falls. Every territory, every alliance, every treaty he's built. 300,000 people depend on him being alive. So when I say this arrangement is not optional, I need you to hear what I'm actually saying." Sable heard it. She heard it in the spaces between his words, in the controlled desperation behind his composure. She was no longer a provisional healer. She was the only thing standing between a king and the dark. That night, lying awake in her infirmary cot, Sable felt her wolf turning restless circles inside her, pacing in a space that had suddenly become too small. Something was waking up. In him. In her. Something that neither of them understood and neither of them could control. And she was terrified of what would happen when it finished waking. A routine formed. Every evening after the palace settled, Sable climbed the stairs to the king's chambers and sat with him while he slept. That was all. She sat. He slept. The simplicity of it felt absurd given the weight Hadrian had placed on the arrangement. The first few nights were painfully awkward. Caleb barely acknowledged her. He would be working when she arrived, bent over maps or correspondence, jaw tight with concentration, fighting his own body for every minute of productivity. He didn't speak to her. She was furniture, functional and invisible, and that was fine. She was used to being furniture, but she noticed things. The way his handwriting deteriorated as evening wore on, letters growing shaky and loose. The way he'd press his fingers against his temples when the headaches hit, a gesture so practiced it had become unconscious. The way his breath would catch and stutter, resisting the pull of sleep even as his body begged for surrender. and then she'd shift in her chair, or turn a page of the medical text she'd taken to bringing, and his breath would deepen. His pen would slow. His eyes would close. And within minutes, the most powerful man in the kingdom would be asleep at his desk, his cheek pressed against reports that decided the fates of nations. She'd watch him then, in those quiet minutes, and feel something complicated and dangerous moving through her. Her wolf, growing stronger daily, settled into a deep, satisfied stillness whenever he slept, as though his rest fed something in her that she hadn't known was starving. On the 8th night, he spoke. "You're reading Aldervane's Materia Medica," he said, not looking up from his work. Sable startled. "You know it. 3rd edition, red binding, pages falling out. Aldervane was a better researcher than bookbinder." A pause. "His chapter on wound sepsis saved more soldiers than any battlefield strategy I ever devised." The king read herbalism texts. The king knew Aldervane by addition. "The chapter on bone-set fungi is outdated," she offered carefully. "His classification doesn't account for altitude variation in spore growth." Caleb looked up. For the first time, he actually looked at her, not through her, but at her, with an expression of surprised interest. "You've observed altitude variation?" "In the border camps, higher elevation wounds responded differently to the same treatments. It took me 3 weeks to figure out why." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but a loosening. An opening. "Tell me," he said. She told him, and when she finished, he asked another question, and another. And before she understood what was happening, they were having a real conversation, two minds working through a problem together, and his eyes were bright with something that wasn't exhaustion. He fell asleep mid-sentence that night, his head dropping onto his folded arms while she was explaining the difference between high altitude and lowland chamomile. She watched the tension drain from his body and felt her wolf settle with a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. After that, conversation became part of the routine. She told him about the border camp, about Theron's terrible bedside manner, about the scout who had been convinced a poultice was a type of bird. He listened. He remembered details days later that proved he'd been paying attention to things she assumed were throwaway words. And small gestures appeared. A proper chair replaced the stiff one she'd been using. A lamp appeared on the table nearest her seat, positioned at the exact angle for reading. A blanket, thick and soft, folded at the foot of the chair for the nights when the fire burned low. He never mentioned these things. She never thanked him directly. It became a silent language between them, care built from objects rather than words. 3 weeks in, Sable woke in the middle of the night to a sound that froze her blood. She had dozed off in the chair, the blanket pulled to her chin. The fire had collapsed to embers. And from the bed, Caleb was making a low, guttural keening, like an animal caught in a trap it couldn't see. She was on her feet before she'd fully woken, crossing the room in the dark, her hand finding his shoulder by instinct. His skin was burning. His muscles were locked rigid, his face contorted in anguish. "Caleb," she said, shaking him, "wake up." And the world fell away. One moment she was beside his bed in the warm amber light of dying embers. The next she was somewhere else entirely. A landscape of ash. Gray sky pressing down like a ceiling. The ground beneath her feet was charred and black, and the air tasted like the aftermath of something catastrophic. Fire long extinguished, but never forgotten. The ashfall. She knew it without being told. This was where he went. This was the place that was eating him alive. She found him standing at the center of a burned clearing, staring at something she couldn't see. The commanding presence that defined him in the waking world was stripped away. He looked diminished, hollowed out. Young in a way that cracked her open. When she followed his gaze, she saw the shapes rising from the charred ground. Figures, dozens of them, pulling themselves upward with slow, terrible determination. Their eyes were empty, their mouths open in silent accusation. Sable seized his hand and pulled. She woke gasping, fingers locked around his wrist. He was awake beside her, eyes wild with something between fury and terror. "You were there," he said. Not a question. "What is that place?" His expression closed like a door slamming shut. The openness of 3 weeks, the conversations, the quiet warmth, all of it vanished behind a wall so complete it was as though it had never existed. "Get out," he said. "Calum, please let me help. This arrangement is over. You will not come back to these rooms. You will not speak of what you saw. Leave. Now." His voice dropped to a register that vibrated through her bones. Pure alpha command. Sable fled. She made it to the stairwell before her legs gave out, sinking onto cold stone steps, trying to breathe through the jagged ache ripping through her. Her wolf was keening. Not the fierce sound from their first meeting, but something broken. Something grieving. He had sent her away. And every cell in her body was screaming that it would kill them both. 5 days without him, and Sable was coming apart. It started with the cold, a bone-deep chill that no fire could touch, that settled into her marrow and stayed. She piled blankets on her infirmary cot, drank hot broth until her stomach protested. Nothing worked. The cold had its own source, and that source was the empty, howling space where her wolf had been content and was now frantic. Then came the headaches. Blinding, nauseating waves that struck without warning and left her gripping the edge of the work table until her knuckles went white. She couldn't focus. Herb names she'd known since childhood scattered from her mind like startled birds. On the 3rd day, her hands began to shake. Sable, whose steady fingers had defined her value in every setting she'd ever worked, watched them betray her while she tried to measure a simple dosage. She spilled the tincture. Theron cleaned it up without a word, which was worse than yelling. Orla found her that evening sitting on the supply room floor with her arms wrapped around her knees. "How long were you going to hide this?" Orla asked, lowering herself down beside her. "He sent me away." "I know. Hadrian told me when it started and when it stopped. And I know why you're falling apart." Orla paused. "Your wolf was dormant your entire life, and then you walked into his room and it woke up. That doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen at all unless the wolves recognize something in each other. He's the Alpha King. I'm a nobody from a pack that threw me out for crimes I didn't commit." "The world doesn't get a vote," Orla replied. "The bond forms, or it doesn't. Yours has formed. Incompletely, which is precisely why you're deteriorating. An incomplete bond is a wound that won't close. The longer you stay apart, the wider it opens." "And him? Is he worse?" "Worse," Orla said flatly. "He hasn't slept since you left. His wolf has retreated so deeply that Hadrian fears it may not come back." 5 days. 5 days of trying to respect his wishes, of trying to honor his command. And it was killing them both. Orla took her hand and squeezed it hard. "Then stop asking for permission." Sable found Hadrian in the war room, alone, staring at a map with the expression of a man running out of options. "I need to see him," she said from the doorway. "He gave orders. No one enters his chambers. He's dying because I'm not there, and I'm dying because he's not here. You know this. You told Orla." Hadrian was quiet for a long moment. "If I let you in, and he sends you away again?" "He won't," Sable said, and she meant it with every desperate piece of herself. "Not this time." Hadrian studied her face, reading something there. Resolve, perhaps, or the kind of certainty that only comes when you've already lost everything once and have nothing left to protect, except the one thing that matters. "The guards change at midnight," he said. "His door will be unlocked." Sable climbed the stairs at midnight with shaking legs and a steady heart. Every step brought her closer, and with every step the cold inside her receded by a fraction. By the third landing, her hands had stopped trembling. By the fourth, she could feel him, a distant warmth at the edge of her awareness, faint and fading but still there, still holding on. Her wolf strained forward, desperate, certain. The corridor outside his chambers was empty. The guards rotated as Hadrian had promised, and the door was unlocked. She stood before it for 3 heartbeats, her palm flat against the wood, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. She pushed open the door. The room was dark. No fire, no lamps. Thin moonlight fell across the floor in pale silver bars. Calum was curled on his side in the bed, rigid, awake. "Go away, Hadrian," he said, his voice raw and hoarse, scraped down to something barely human. "It's not Hadrian," Sable said. He went completely still, then turned over slowly, and the moonlight caught his face, and Sable's breath stopped. He looked destroyed. 5 days had done what 7 months of decline hadn't managed. Gaunt, sunken, the color of ash. He looked like a man who had been fighting something relentless and had finally stopped fighting. "You shouldn't be here." But his voice broke on the last word, and his eyes were bright with something that had nothing to do with command and everything to do with a man who was drowning and had just seen shore. "You don't get to decide that," Sable said, crossing the room. "You don't get to push me away and call it protection while it destroys us both. That's not noble. That's cowardice. And I didn't survive exile and silver cuffs and starting over from nothing just to stand outside your door and let you die." She sat on the edge of the bed. His body was already responding, breath deepening, steadying, involuntary and inevitable, like a tide answering the moon. "We share a bond," she said quietly, her hand finding his. "You know it. Your wolf knows it, wherever it's hiding right now. I'm already under, Calum. I've been under since the moment my wolf woke up for the first time in my life." His fingers tightened around hers so hard it hurt. A wrecked sound escaped his throat, and he pulled her toward him. The kiss was desperate and shattering and tasted like salt, and Sable wasn't sure which of them was crying. His hands found her face, her hair, pulling her against him like he was trying to close a gap that distance had carved between their bones. She kissed him back with everything she had, every ounce of fear and fury and desperate love that had been building since her wolf first howled. When the mating bite came, it was instinct, the bond marking them both, sealing itself between them like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting for exactly this. She felt it settle in, golden and fierce and permanent, weaving through every part of her until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. Afterward, they lay tangled together, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear for the first time since she'd known him. She could feel him now, the warmth and depth of a man who carried a kingdom on his back and had never once asked anyone to help him hold it. He surrendered to sleep so completely it felt sacred. Sable lay beside him and felt joy bloom like something that had been waiting her whole life to flower. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, and woke in a field of ash. The ashfall was worse than she remembered. The sky had lowered, pressing down on the scorched landscape like a lid being sealed. The ash was thicker now, drifting in slow, heavy flakes that dissolved against her skin like black snow. The ground beneath her feet pulsed faintly, as though something massive was breathing underneath. Calum was at the center, kneeling with his hands pressed flat against the blackened earth. Sable ran to him. Her bare feet made no sound on the charred ground, and the silence was so complete that her own heartbeat felt obscene. "Calum," she said, dropping to her knees beside him. "I'm here. Look at me." He didn't look. His eyes were fixed on the shapes rising from the ash, dozens becoming hundreds. Wolves and humans, soldiers and civilians, faces too young for what their eyes accused him of. But these weren't ghosts. That was what made her blood run cold. They were his memory of them. She felt it through the bond, the full scope of what the ashfall actually was. Not a curse, not an external prison. Caleb had built this place himself, brick by agonizing brick, from every decision that had cost a life, every order that had sent someone to die, every face he couldn't save and couldn't forget. The Sunderland Campaign, the border wars, 3 territories absorbed, hundreds of skirmishes, and a body count that no victory could justify in the mind of the man who had ordered the advance. His wolf hadn't retreated because of illness. It retreated because Caleb had decided, in the deepest, most unreachable part of himself, that he didn't deserve it. That a man who had caused this much death didn't deserve his wolf, didn't deserve rest, didn't deserve peace. The ashfall was his punishment, and he had been feeding it every night for months. "You built this," Sable whispered, horrified. "You're doing this to yourself." A figure stepped forward from the mass, a boy, barely 16, wearing the remnants of a scout's uniform. Half his face was burned. He looked at Caleb with an expression of patient, bottomless sorrow. "Emery," Caleb said, and the name came out broken. "He was a runner. 15 years old, I sent him ahead to scout the pass because he was the fastest. I sent him because he was the fastest, and the pass was rigged with fire traps." She felt his guilt detonate through the bond like a shockwave. Not just for Emery, for all of them. Every face in the ash was a name he knew, a story he carried, a death he had weighed against the strategic necessity that demanded it and found the scale forever, permanently unbalanced. "You think you deserve this," she said, tears streaming freely. "You think if you suffer enough, it balances out." He didn't deny it. Through the bond, she felt the raw, howling truth of it. Sable took his face in her hands and turned it toward her. His eyes were hollow, stripped of everything except grief. "Listen to me," she said. "I know what it feels like to believe you deserve to suffer. I spent my whole life believing that if I had been better, different, more worthy, my father would have chosen me. That his silence was a verdict. That being thrown away meant I was garbage." Her voice broke, but she kept going. "And I was wrong. His silence was about him, not me. His cowardice was his failure, not mine. And this—" She gestured at the ashfall, at the hundreds of accusing faces, at the smoldering landscape of manufactured guilt. "This is you refusing to forgive yourself for being human, for making impossible decisions in impossible circumstances, and not being omniscient enough to save everyone." "Emery died because of me," Caleb said. "Emery died because of war," Sable replied. "And war happened because you were protecting 300,000 people who depended on you. You didn't choose between Emery's life and nothing. You chose between his life and 1,000 others. And that choice destroyed you. And you've been letting it destroy you because you think a good king would have found a third option that didn't exist." She pressed her forehead against his. "You are allowed to grieve them," she whispered. "You are allowed to carry their names, but you are not allowed to die for them. Not when your kingdom needs you. Not when I need you." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The ash kept falling. The figures kept watching. Then Caleb's hands came up and covered hers, and she felt something shift through the bond. Not a breaking, not a sudden dramatic collapse, but a releasing. A slow, deliberate unclenching. A fist that had been closed for so long its fingers had forgotten any other shape. Finally, painfully, choosing to open. "I'm sorry," he said to the figures in the ash, to Emery, to all of them. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry there wasn't a better way." The boy with the burned face looked at him for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes, and the ash around him softened, and he dissolved like smoke into still air. One by one, the others followed. Face after face releasing, dissolving, drifting upward and away. The ashfall lightened. The ground cooled. The terrible, pressing sky began to lift, and beneath the ash, something stirred. Something massive and ancient and alive. A surge of raw, primal power rising from somewhere deep, crashing upward through Calum like a wave breaking through a dam. His wolf. It came roaring back with a force that shook the ground, that blew the remaining ash outward in a great spiraling gust, that filled the bond with a heat so fierce it burned away every shadow in its path. Calum gasped, gripping her hands as his wolf reclaimed the territory it had surrendered, flooding him with a vitality that poured through the bond into Sable until she was burning with it too. The ashfall shattered. Sable woke in his bed, in his arms, gasping for air. Dawnlight poured through the windows, golden and warm. Calum was awake beside her, his eyes wet, his face open and raw and more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. But he was smiling, not the controlled, diplomatic expression she'd seen in corridors. A real smile, full and unguarded, and it transformed his face into something so beautiful it hurt to look at. "It's gone," he said, wonder and disbelief braided through every syllable. "The ashfall. It's gone." She reached up and touched his cheek, felt the warmth of his skin, felt the bond humming between them. "Your wolf?" she asked. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they flashed amber gold, the unmistakable sign of an alpha's wolf surging to the surface. "Right here," he said, his voice thick, "right where it belongs." Sable held him while he shook, while the relief and the grief and the overwhelming magnitude of what had happened moved through him like a storm. She held him the way she wished someone had held her the night she walked through Thornfield's gate. And when the storm passed, and his arms tightened around her with a strength that was no longer desperate but sure, he said something that rearranged every broken piece of her into a new and shining shape. "Marry me," he said against her hair. "Not because of the bond, not because of duty, because I have been in the dark for 7 months, and you are the only light I want." Sable pulled back to look at him, tears streaming, and laughed. "You're proposing while we're both crying, and I haven't brushed my hair in 2 days. Is that a no?" "It's a yes, you impossible man." He kissed her, slow and deep and tasting of salt and morning light, and somewhere in the corridors below, Hadrian paused mid-stride, tilted his head, and allowed himself the smallest, most private smile of his life. The crown landed at her feet like a dead thing, but this time, Sable knew the story behind it. She knew about the mud and the silver cuffs and the silence that had nearly broken her. She knew about the ashfall and the boy named Emery and the king who had nearly let his own guilt consume him because he believed justice demanded it. She knew about the bond that had woken her wolf from a lifelong sleep, and the nights spent learning that healing wasn't something you did once, but something you chose every single day. And she knew about the man standing on the dais, the man who still had nightmares sometimes, who still carried every name, who still woke in the dark reaching for her, but who had learned, slowly and imperfectly, and with more courage than any battlefield had ever required, to put the weight down long enough to live. 300 wolves watched her. The court held its breath. Somewhere in the crowd, Hadrian stood with the faintest trace of satisfaction on his face. Beside him, Orla pressed a handkerchief to her eyes and pretended she wasn't crying. Sable bent down and picked up the crown. It was heavier than she expected. Gold and garnet, warm from his hands, real in a way that made her breath catch. She looked up at Calum, and his dark eyes were bright with tears and something fiercer than love. She climbed the steps of the dais. The hall was so silent she could hear the candles breathing. Calum took the crown from her hands and placed it on her head, and the weight of it settled against her temples like an answer to a question she had spent her whole life asking. Am I enough? The girl inside her whispered. The one who had set her plate apart from the others, who had walked through the gate without looking back, who had rebuilt herself from ash and silence and sheer, stubborn refusal to disappear. Caleb looked at her like she was the axis the world turned on. My queen, he said, and the hall erupted. That night, in chambers that were now theirs, Sable lay in the dark with her head on his chest and listened to him breathe. Steady and deep and even. No ash, no fire, no figures rising from scorched earth. Just the quiet rhythm of a man at peace, his arm around his mate, his wolf settled and whole and present. She pressed her palm flat against his heartbeat and closed her eyes. Outside, the kingdom slept, and for the first time in a very long time, so did its king.